The Florida Gators are getting hot on the recruiting trail, and we're going to bring John Garcia in to talk with us about that.
You are Locked On Gators, your daily podcast on the Florida Gators. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Joining me now for Locked On Gators is John Garcia, Locked On's recruiting insider. And John, we're getting right into it because it is recruiting season. Florida's hot on the trail, and we have to talk about this where Florida has 2 running back commits, and apparently another one, which is great because, even if you get a third commit for this year, you average 2 on the year for the past 2 seasons. So we can go with that approach. But yeah, another running back attempting for Florida.
Yeah, well, look, it's recruiting, right? It's fluid. Every fan base deals with the question marks around, one, how many do you take per position, and two, how much insurance is sort of built up thereafter. And I think that overlaps, obviously, with the running back situation in particular, right? This is a potentially expansive running back board. This class is also looking better at the position here as time goes on. The guys we thought were kind of alone at the top a year ago in 24 are now crowded. They're looking around. It's a big blue chip running back class in 2024. So a program like Florida that has already shown the propensity to prioritize the run with multiple backs successfully is going to have a bit of a higher ceiling in its pursuit. Obviously, it started early with Bowens jumping on board in state as his stock sort of blew up thereafter, and then of course Daniels jumping in from Mississippi. But there's Floridians that are still involved with the Gators. Stacey Gage is one that, my goodness, since his freshman year we were hearing about. Right, hey, the IMG's getting this back. That's going to be this big time player, and he's really lived up to it when he's on the field. He's bounced around a little bit, a couple different high schools, but now he's down at St. Thomas Aquinas, probably ahead of another state championship ring, and his recruitment is still very much wide open. I think this one has changed over the course of the last year or so as he's moved around a little bit. Like I said, everyone's running back board has shifted, and it's affected Gage's status. I think with certain schools early on, it was like Ohio State, Alabama, Oklahoma. And of those three, I think Oklahoma is the only one still really pushing because Ohio State has 2 backs committed. Other schools have sort of made some moves here. So it's reverted back to the Sooners, which is the school he calls home. They're going to stay in it until the end, in my opinion. And then the in-state schools have kind of come back around on Gage, with Florida and Miami being 2 of the primary contenders there. So, of course, he was in Gainesville for the spring game and had a lot of good things to say. Look, if you go to IMG in St. Thomas, competition is not an issue for you. So that's something as a potential third back he's not going to view as a negative with a school like Florida, which is important, right? Because when you're bringing in guys that are extremely coveted and productive like Bowens and Daniels, if you're going to grab a third, he's got to be really comfortable with who he is or who he thinks he is as a player. So I think in that regard, Gage, of course, also geographically as a Florida native, would make a lot of sense for the Gators. But I think there's some insurance at play too. We've talked a lot, Brandon, about how coveted Bowens is. And we thought it was sort of just Ohio State, Georgia, a sprinkle of Alabama, but then he showed up on Tennessee's campus. I heard a rumor that Miami was trying to get him to make the semi-local visit as well. So this is something that is something you got to just pay attention to as a Gator fan, and certainly as a coach on that staff. So Stacey Gage becomes maybe a little bit more important than he would present as a third back. And ditto for Rod Gainey, another in-stater, Tampa native, even with more ties to the program, but a different back than Gage, right? Gage, big, powerful downhill in between the tackles, churner, workhorse type. And I think Gainey's got a little bit more space value. He could play the slot. He could be your change of pace, all-purpose back from a traditional sense. So you understand Florida continuing to potentially leave that door open because of its class and because of its two-headed monster on the current roster, which can always create movement. And, there's no reason to believe that Johnson would be on the roster in 24. And who knows what happens with ETN, whose stock is seemingly only going up simultaneously. So it's something you have to sort of keep fluid, as college football has suggested.
Yeah, if Chauncey Bowens goes to Miami,
I'm not projected that or
I'm not saying you're projecting it, but if it happens, I am going to do everything I can to get Dono fired. That's my goal. And Dono will pay for the sins of the Miami Hurricanes. But for Stacey Gage and Rod Gainey, how would they kind of play complementary back to Chauncey Bowens and Daniels? Because look, Florida's going to use multiple running backs, like you mentioned, two-headed monster right now. Montrell, no, like you said, no purpose. He should be on the roster in 2024. Trevor Etienne, no purpose. He should be on the roster in 2025. So with all these new backs coming in, how would Stacey Gage, Rod Gainey complement Chauncey Bowens, Daniels, and even Trayon Webb?
Yeah, let's not forget about him. I think he had the most carries in the spring game itself. Look, I think what's interesting about the Gator 1-2 punch right now that we see, Johnson and ETN, it's not about variance. It's just about these are two alphas, and they're similar to me, and let's get them both carries. It's not really a stylistic difference between those two. So I do think that there's a bit of a need, and Trayon Webb is closer to that mold than the all-purpose type as well. I think there's a bit of a need for a 3-down back type. Now, I think Bowens is probably among the two current commits the most capable, and both Gainey and Gage are comfortable operating out of the backfield as well. So I do think there's somewhat of a need, or it's almost an unknown with the current guys, just how effective and increasingly effective they could be in that element. But in terms of stylistically and body type, yeah, Gainey's, your small scat back type. Everyone else is sort of built like a conventional SEC running back of, the early 2000s, which again, Florida has literally shown is okay. You don't have to have that true stylistic opposite in the backfield to be a compliment. It could just be two conventional, productive, high floor backs. And I think that's kind of the formula that this coaching staff wants to operate with going forward. So if you do take a third back, it could really go either way. It could go, hey, let's Gage is more in the mold of what Florida's been successful with, and Gainey is the opposite of that. So if you do want variance, I think he would probably be the pick. And I think there's probably a little bit more traction with Gainey than Gage, just relative to Florida. I think if Florida was to push for each, I think Gainey would probably be quicker to jump on the boat. There's a sense that Gage is going to take longer in his recruitment. He's talking about official visits during the season as well. So I think his recruitment can push closer to the winter months and signing day compared to Gainey, who I think is getting closer to beginning to narrow this thing down for good.
Yeah, Florida fans, myself included, like to use like thunder and lightning for Montrell Johnson and Trevor Etienne, but they're literally both just home run hitters,
right?
Nonstop. It's ridiculous. Hey, you! Something exciting is coming to Built.com on April 22nd. I don't have all the details yet, but the excitement is real, and it's something that you won't want to miss. If you know how Built works, they have the most incredible protein bars in the world, and they do these amazing flavor drops with unreal flavors in limited quantity. So mark your calendars and head to Built.com on Saturday, April 22nd, to be one of the first to discover what all the hype is about. But don't. Just know, I'm just telling you this. I can't wait to see what the new flavor is. I'm stoked for it, but make sure to use promo code LOCKEDON15 and you'll get 15% off your order with Built or BuiltBar.com. Flipping to the defensive side of the ball, another linebacker for the Florida Gators, who, of course, Myles Graham, Adarius Hayes, and today we're going to talk about Kris Jones, but just even before that, just another linebacker in a class where 2023, Florida brought in one linebacker in the high school class, again, averaging 2, assuming they get another one for the 2024 class.
Yeah, this is a bit different to me. I think this is more about, hey, if there's a great player that wants in and continues to push and show interest on his end, you've got to acknowledge it. And I think, again, stylistically, Kris Jones plays similar to Adarius Hayes, in my opinion. He's aggressive. He can work on the edge. He's comfortable at the second level off the ball as well. But he's also a great blitzer. So there's a little bit of Graham in there too. So you really can't have enough guys who fit some type of third down role to where Jones could be a pass rusher or potentially contend underneath as a zone coverage supporter. So that's something that's extremely coveted coast to coast. And that's why Florida's in it with Georgia and Ohio State and some really, blue-blooded programs for the Jones recruitment. But he continues to say the right things about the Gators. He loved that sample during the spring game. He's built a quick relationship with Austin Armstrong as well. So this is something that I think it's one of the maybe surprises of the late spring for Florida, to where, you wouldn't optically say, hey, this kid from Stafford, Virginia is going to take a trip and kind of jump right into Florida being a true contender for his recruitment. But that's kind of what's happened with the case of Kris Jones. So I think on defense, it's a little different, right? Volume is a little bit more important to me than stylistic differences, because you just need bodies. I mean, you rotate more on defense typically. So those guys are also able to hit the ground running a little bit sooner. So those polished prospects that already have, that expectation of being a blue chipper and carrying that right into their college career. I mean, those have even more value earlier in the cycle itself. And anytime a coaching staff is going to link you to a player that we think is this star in the making, and they're talking Shamar James comps with Kris Jones, it's just something that you have to understand is going to be a big deal. Because I don't think coaching staffs play the comparison game as much as we do, certainly. So when they do it, especially with a current Gator, I do think that there's an angle there, and there's a reason why, as a recruit, you're like, oh, that's great to hear. I appreciate it. So that the rise of Florida, when you dig into it, starts to make a little bit more sense with Jones, regardless of who's already committed.
Yeah, comparing him to a current Gator that has also like been demolishing spring and they've been very public about it is definitely great. But just talking from a recruiting perspective, if you were Kris Jones and you watched that spring game, which we know not a ton of points scored, wasn't great, 10-7, but you saw a defense that was just aggressive, creative, physical, attacking, every word you can use to describe Austin Armstrong's defense. How do you kind of feel about that when you're not Kris Jones, but just conceptually, how do you kind of feel about that if you are Kris Jones, where you go, okay, like this defense just was wrecking this offense the entire night?
Right. And Kris works best coming downhill, whether it's as a blitzer or as a stand-up edge, which he shows a lot on Friday nights as well. So yeah, you understand why something like that is going to be even extra appealing compared to maybe some other schemes that he's working with or considering in his recruitment. And again, as we said leading up to the spring game itself, it's just different when you see it in person. It's different when you hear Armstrong barking out the signals and the linebackers checking at the line of scrimmage and then the execution thereafter. It's just different than what a practice can simulate. Just like when we get to the season, that is different than any practice or spring game can simulate, so there's kind of layers to it. But for this time of year, that's about as good as it gets, especially for defensive recruits, because as we all know, the defenses are always a little bit of ahead of the offense, even when it's a new situation like it is for Armstrong with the Florida Gators. So it's just easier to see than implementing a whole new offense and saying, hey, these are some of the things we want to do, but it doesn't quite look right. Defensively, it's going to look right a little bit sooner than trying to put in a brand new offense. So I think in those regards, it's just easier to sell to a recruit who's kind of been there and done that. And I think that's why Jones and this Florida thing has started to bubble up. I've heard, without looking for it, I've heard real traction with Jones and the Gators. And again, you talk about optics, it'd be a heck of a win to go head to head with Georgia and Ohio State. You've done it thus far for Bowens on offense. So to do so on defense for a guy like Kris Jones, I think would be a pretty big deal.
Yeah, doing it on the defensive side of the ball with Austin Armstrong being in here and just everything he's been bringing to the table. If you're a Florida Gators fan, how would you feel about that recruitment right now for Kris Jones?
Certainly better as time goes on here. I don't know if he's dead set on a preseason decision. That is the most popular window right now that kids are talking about. So you feel good about the chances of grabbing an official visit and continuing to stay right in the thick of this thing. Because really what Florida was behind with Jones was the development, or the relationship, I should say, with Armstrong, and kind of viewing it interpersonally, which he's now done, and then the visits. I mean, those are really the two. And geography was probably the main reason why those were the two elements that Florida had to begin to make up ground with, and they've checked both boxes with one visit. So if you get another official visit out of it, closer to that decision making window, I think you got to feel even better about it from Florida's perspective. So this is one that I think Florida is starting to make up ground for, maybe quicker than most prospects that are on the board, especially when you talk about out of state recruits.
Third segment of the day, another of the day with Marqavious Saboor. Florida's got him on campus. Just what kind of player is he, where Florida is not even averaging 2 safeties per cycle now? They'd be averaging like 47 with him. So
Yeah, he's interesting. Big two-way threat, really good wide receiver prospect that I've seen in person. But he's really, as a defender, with his combination of playmaking ability and instincts, he's been a big stock up guy. So whereas Jones and Gage and these guys have been recruits for several years, I think Saboor's stock is continually rising to where he's adding offers by the week. And I think Florida even offered in January or February. So he's one that is still very much new to this part of the process. A lot of schools are starting to jump in that race, so I think he's going to try to continue to take trips and explore. But he was at Florida, I think, Monday, and came out of the trip really high on the Gators. Already talking about an official visit, which is sort of the next box to check, just from a traditional timeline standpoint. Because when you're an ascending recruit, you do one of two things: you jump on one of the offers pretty quickly because you've been waiting on it, or you allow the full blow up to go through, and you get to the bulk of the off season, which is those June official visits, and then you really start to narrow things down. But yeah, I mean, programs like Clemson and Ohio State, Miami, a lot of schools are getting involved here for Saboor, Ole Miss as well. So this one is a true expanding recruitment. So good for Florida to get that quick unofficial, maintain that interest, and kind of see where it goes from there. But no doubt the Florida's helped themselves since offering.
yeah, and we talk about Florida recruiting, and it's been another running back because you've got 2, another linebacker because you got 2, another safety because you have 2. But what do you think of Florida's approach here of saying, yeah, we're just completely blitzkrieging these these positions this year?
Yeah, I think particularly on defense with Jones and Saboor, they've got some versatility in their games. And I think with Saboor, he could be this traditional safety, maybe the aggressive type, a trading type, but I think he's got the frame to continue to bulk up and expand to a nickel type role. So getting closer to maybe a Amari Burney territory, right? A true hybrid that really just operates well in the middle of the field, whether he's close to the line of scrimmage or not. And you really can't have enough of that, and I think he's different stylistically than some of the other DBs that are either on board or Florida's after at this point. Thinking of like a Jordan Pride. I mean, that's a classic free safety, center fielder, length, range, ball skills, all of those things, kind of the opposite of what you say with Saboor. So in that regard, it would work stylistically from Florida's perspective. And ditto with Jones. He's a guy who we talked about as a pass rusher, as a true second level player on the edge, but no doubt comfortable, working off ball, kind of like we talk about with the Darius Hayes as a traditional linebacker. So I think volume again on defense is something that you can never really have enough of. I mean, look at Florida's D-line haul from 23, the DB haul as well, right? Just massive numbers because you've got to find fits. And unfortunately, you're just dealing with more fluidity than you ever have in college football. I think that's always important to bring up, whether you're talking really any position, from quarterback all the way on down. I mean, we're seeing kickers in the portal, right? I mean, so this thing it's fluid everywhere in this day and age. Starters are entering the portal once again, not something maybe I anticipated in the spring. I thought it'd be the backups who lost those battles, but we're seeing starters entering the portal and getting some traction. So I just think the fluidity is just at an apex right now. And you've got to bring in as much volume and versatility, and defensively, these guys would satisfy those pursuits. And I think it's something you should expect even more of going forward from Florida and most schools.
Yeah, and we'll talk more in depth about this another day, but I did want to quickly ask you just your thoughts on how, I guess we'll say how recruiting has changed lately with, because I'm just thinking about it now with, I mean, portals bigger than ever. You've got the official visit change now where
Yep.
you've got that restriction lift, but you've also got, scholarship limits are going to be coming back. So just how impossible is it to just consistently recruit successfally with all of these changes going on?
Yeah, I had a college coach message me when the official visit rule came out. I was like, man, this is probably the last straw for me. Like I'm gonna grab a job in the league and kind of sit tight for the rest of my days. Cause yeah, it was already a nightmare for these college coaches. Not to, pat them on the back, they're millionaires in some cases, but or high level thousandaires, worst case. But yeah, it really is kind of a mess. There's going to be a recruit, probably from the state of Florida, let's be honest, who's going to take 10 officials, right? Because you can. And it's going to be, a college game day type tour. And I wouldn't blame the recruit, right? So the programs now, because that number hasn't changed for them, now they have to be even more diligent about who they fly out to campus. And that's something that I think, as a principal or in principle, will extend these decisions, right? If you were on the fence about committing preseason, but during the season you can take 5 more trips to and coincide those trips with some big time games, probably lean that way, right? So I think there's going to be more flips, more decommitments, and later initial decisions simultaneously with this official visit rule, because now logistics and just the means of the player's family or his inner circle, it just don't matter anymore. And that was such a big detractor from schools trying to recruit from far away. So imagine, prospects in Florida, Texas, Georgia, California, et cetera, getting up to, the Big Ten schools and vice versa. Now, if you're Florida, you can go into Michigan with a little bit more gusto and say, hey, this is a state that's producing a little bit more elite prospects than we're used to. Let's bring in a couple of these kids for visits, because now it's just something that is more possible, because it's not just the true contenders that a kid's going to go see. It's kind of everyone if he wants to, and I think that's going to be encouraged. So yeah, recruiting's somehow going to get even crazier, and the programs are going to feel it more so than the kids, who should take advantage of the new rules.
Yeah, and I know that it's way in the future, and we're not going to talk too much about it. But 2025, Florida offered this week, I think it was, two Michigan kids,
Yep.
the QB and someone from Cass Tech, which, I mean, I know what Cass Tech is, so I feel like most people probably understand Cass Tech as a high school program itself. But thank you so much, John. This was John Garcia, Locked On's recruiting insider. Catch him all throughout the Locked On College channel and every week on Locked On Gators.